This week we're at Rochester Cemetery. It was established in 1870, shortly after the railway line through the town was built. Before that, there was a small, unofficial cemetery operating just down the road from here, on High Street. When this cemetery was established, the old cemetery headstones were relocated, but the bodies still remained. This caused a few problems when people started building on the old site. Many of the bones were dug up accidentally when underground utilities were put in. That's a little disturbing. The cemetery isn't the only thing in Rochester to have moved though. High Street used to be the town's main street, but the town's focus shifted to the other side of the Campaspe River with the arrival of rail access. Maybe that's why the cemetery was also moved. The old site was no longer the dead centre of town. Rose Ellen Spencer was the first recorded burial in this site. She was a toddler from a prominent family in town, being the operators of the post office, the store, and the flour mill. Patrick Doherty was regarded by many as the King of Rochester, having been one of the original settlers and the owner of the town's first hotel. Patrick had immigrated from Ireland in 1852 and moved to Bendigo in 1864 to try his luck in the gold rush. When that didn't work out as he dreamed, he took employment as a storeman for Mr. Hugh McDevitt. During this time, there was an opportunity to purchase several blocks of land in Rochester, which he and Hugh did. Shortly after this, Patrick left Hugh's employment to chase the gold rush to Spring Creek. But by this time, it seemed he'd learned, you don't make money from digging. You make it by supplying the men that dig. He opened a store on the goldfields, and by 1869, he earned enough to obtain a liquor license and built his hotel and a general store amongst Rochester's first permanent buildings. From here, Patrick truly cemented himself in the town, establishing himself as a lifeline for local farmers by buying their products, selling them supplies, and even lending them money. He quickly earned a reputation for being honest and shrewd, and was a strong advocate for the region, serving on the council for 30 years. John Gaffney was a chemist who worked out of the Rochester Hotel. He and his business partner, Dr. Taft, had something of a disagreement at one point. The doctor had formally charged John with misappropriation of funds. Their association up until this point must have already been rather strained, as this occasion inspired John to write a letter explaining and denying the accusation and outlining the various ways he had felt hard done by, as well as making a string of accusations of his own about the doctor's lack of care for his patients. He then loaded a shotgun and fired from the hotel balcony at Dr. Taft as he was preparing his horses for departure. The shots lodged in the doctor's shoulder and neck. Assuming that the doctor was now about to leave this world, John returned to his office and shot himself. The doctor survived. The letter was read aloud at the inquest, and the verdict was simple. John Gaffney has maliciously and willfully taken his own life while labouring under great mental excitement. It is worth noting at this point that John Gaffney was Catholic, and local Catholic tradition states that if one is to commit suicide, they are not to be buried in Catholic ground, that they should be buried amongst the paupers without a headstone. Luckily for John, he had enough people who loved him, and that he was in fact buried amongst the Catholics and did receive a headstone. Thomas William McMaster built Rochester's Shamrock Hotel in 1912. He also served as councillor from 1908 until 1930 and was instrumental in arranging the construction of a bridge over the Campaspe River in 1917. Harriet Cruikshank was famous as the operator of the first hospital in Rochester. Her daughter Violet went away to study to be a nurse, and on her return in 1906, the two ran the hospital as a nursing home for the elderly. The hospital operated up until Violet's death in September of 1976. She was aged 91. James Hart, pictured here with his wife, came from Kyneton in 1873 and opened a blacksmith business in Rochester, which remained for 115 years. Can you believe? Surviving 5 generations up until its closure in 1988. The Hart family were known far and wide for their implements and wagon building, blacksmithing and farrier work. The building in this photo was demolished shortly after the business closed. This photo is of James's son William and his wife Elizabeth and their children. Elizabeth liked to keep thorough books of the business and what was going on in the town, keeping notes of when the river was higher than normal and when people had passed away. Many of these journals are now in the possession of the Rochester Historical Society and provide a great insight into the goings-on in the town around this period. Other belongings of their family held by the society include the family Bible and Elizabeth's prayer book. William Webb came to Australia in 1859, only to leave for Otage goldfields in New Zealand. He was moderately successful, but returned to Australia after surviving a severe snowstorm in Gabriel's Gully, which claimed the lives of 300 people. On return to Australia, he settled on a block of land just outside of Rochester, where he built a house that still stands today. The heritage-listed Random House was purchased by the Department of Human Services in the 2000s to operate as an Aboriginal healing centre. The building has since been abandoned, and years of vandalism has left it in need of desperate repair. Many members of the town hope that one day someone will come and breathe life back into this glorious old building. This section at the back of the cemetery is what was referred to as the paupers section, because this is where they would bury anyone who couldn't afford the cost of a burial. There are many paupers and children buried under this very road. This wall was erected to remember those people in those unmarked graves. In 1891, Walter Robbins left school at the age of 12 after obtaining his merit certificate. From what I've been able to find out, at the time, many children between the ages of 11 and 14 who had no intention of continuing their education would sit an exam to prove that they had adequate education and were ready to enter the workforce. Walter started working as a painter at the age of 13, going on to open his own business just a few short years later, which he stayed in until retirement, at which point his son took over. He lived to the ripe old age of 106. Quite an impressive feat. Where most rural town cemeteries seem to be shrinking over time, Rochester is growing. The council has just purchased the paddocks behind the cemetery to expand into. I would like to give a very special thanks to Rochester Historical and Pioneer Society for providing me with a lot of this information today. I highly recommend you go there. They are open on Wednesdays and Fridays, or upon request.